So I'm very happy to hand over to my colleague Daniel Moser again, who is interviewing Holger Dalkmann in Berlin. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Armin. And we are now live with Holger Dalkmann. Holger Dalkmann is a mobility expert and a veteran, you could say, of the sustainable transport world. And he is the founder and CEO of Sustain 2030. And currently, he is also acting as advisor to the high volume transport program of the British government. So thank you, Holger, for being with us today on TUMI TV. We had a great session in the morning covering Asia. We went over to Europe and Africa, and now we have you live on TUMI TV, and we're very happy for that. How are you today, Holger?
Very good, thanks. Greetings from Berlin, and it's a pleasure to be here, and great event so far. Really enjoying it. Congrats to you and the team.
Thank you, Holger, for these kind words. And as you are in Berlin, just let me ask you a question. How is the situation in Berlin at the moment? Is there still reduced volumes of transport, or is everything going back to normal?
No, thankfully, also it's still also reduced. Obviously, also there are strict rules also for the public transport, but at the same time, as we heard in the presentation earlier, Berlin was really active in terms of coming up also with pop-up bike lanes. So really excited about that. And even as I have one also directly also in front of my house on a 6th lane, usually it's on a 6-lane road, suddenly also comes up also the much needed bike lane. So that's fantastic.
Great. That's great to hear that Berlin is acting together with a handful of cities, I believe, around the world, and I hope this number of cities is growing. And
so I didn't know currently also if there is a technical glitch. Armin, can you enlighten us what happened?
So there are obviously some connectivity issues in Bonn. Please just go ahead, Holger.
Okay, so I think the question also Daniel wanted to ask is, in fact, we recently worked with a high volume transport program funded also by DFID on an initial piece to have an overlook about what international transport stakeholders and initial initiatives are doing, responding also to the COVID crisis. And some of the key findings are, first of all, the transport community have been very, very active, sharing also case studies, specific guidance on cleaning buses and vehicles, information about micromobility and so on and so forth. However, what we also found was there was a huge gap in terms of information on low-income countries. And congratulations also to the TUMI team today also to make also low-income countries and the specific challenges around informal transport, situation also in informal settlement, front and centers of this event also today. At the same time, what we have seen is there seem to be more and more funding available, particularly from the multilateral development banks, but there's no current specific trust fund or anything, particularly getting into the transport and COVID-19. And we heard earlier from your ministry how important also that is. So it's vital also that we pay even also more attention also to that, and also come up really also with a common global agenda also responding also on transport.
Thank you very much, Holger. I'm back on air. Sorry, there was a short glitch in our connection, but we're very happy that we could fix this. And we're now online, and we hope we can stay online. And thank you for your answer also. I think one aspect I wanted to point you towards and hear your opinion and your expertise. You hear from Berlin that they had basically pre-made templates which they used to roll out the temporary bike lanes. Now, having these templates made requires some sort of capacity, some sort of knowledge about how do you actually construct bike lanes in a very quick manner. So my question to you would be, do you see this kind of very quick rollout of temporary bike lanes? Do you see this as a big window of opportunity for emerging and developing countries also to act upon?
Absolutely, Daniel. Particularly when we see also the numbers in terms of the people walking and partially also cycling in those cities, and particularly as the most vulnerable users. So in that respect, we see also that people also walking and cycling can actually need also more space. So to keep also the physical distance there. So it's a great opportunity. But at the same time, what we have not seen is in fact also far detailed information in terms of how to do that. We have seen that in Paris, in London, in Brussels, and so on. So we hear a lot about also the capitals. But what is needed also is how do I do that also in second and third tier cities immediately to pick that up also in Africa and Asia. And therefore, I think we haven't seen also enough of that. We've seen in the US, for example, there's a center, transport response center, funded also by Bloomberg Philanthropies, really also providing us a lot of information in one place, and I think we need a similar targeted platform for those countries and for those solutions.
What you're suggesting sounds like we would need some sort of Africa mobility hub or Asia mobility hub, which kind of bundles the information, but also provides the capacity which is needed. I believe in an earlier research paper which you put out, you try to calculate the number of people which would actually be needed to take care of the explosive city growth we have and the corresponding needs for sustainable transport infrastructure. Could you explain these findings from your side a little bit?
Sure, absolutely. And I think it fits quite well also in the current discussion around also COVID-19. We know also that capacity and institutional setup are absolute key features also to transform sustainable mobility and here to provide us with the right information at the right time. What we have seen is a capacity gap. So the amount of people working, particularly in second and third tier cities, are minor, when we need more financiers into that. But at the same time, we need a better supply in terms of university and the education there. With COVID-19 now and some of the international financial institutions saying we are committed, we want to provide more support, that's actually an opportunity now is to get in saying, well, we have this gap. Without that gap, we can't really also act on sustainable mobility in those cities which are most at need. And so therefore, we should also provide, apart from the infrastructure investment, also investors in human capacity. And in terms of what GIZ and others could do is, in fact, what you already do here. And we are going digital, and we're going, in fact, also very fast here. And so we have to transform the knowledge we have into better courses and better training opportunities.
Mm-hmm. And as part of your research activity and your advisory capacity within the high volume transport program of the British government, you also put out a paper with recommendations towards COVID-19. So what I hear from your side right now is that actually these are very well and closely linked aspects. On the one side, the lack of capacity for people to actually plan the systems and in cities which might not even be there right now. And on the other side, the massive window of opportunity to act on something right now, as we are actually in a moment of crisis which can act as a sort of trigger for sustainable transport transformation you earlier mentioned.
Yeah, I think what we came up with was a kind of three-pronged action agenda, and that also relates to really also sharing information, collecting information, particularly on low-income countries, and develop technical and specific policy guidance. So here, the need also for providers of the right information really also targeted. The second is, as we talked about, is the idea of a hub, a common platform, because currently there's more and more information. When you Google in these days transport and COVID-19, you get up to 2 billion searches. So how can I actually really also find the right information? So I would call for all the partners together, come more together in terms of creating a common global transport agenda, creating a common platform, and actors and talkers far more with one voice.
Yes, thank you very much, Holger. And I think this is a great way of putting it into perspective, that we actually need to bring the information and the knowledge which is out there closer to people around the world who are engaged in the challenges of making transformative mobility reality and changing mobility in a sustainable manner. So this is a great perspective you're putting on this. I think as my final question, I would also like to ask you how you are seeing, as a veteran in the mobility sector, an international expert, basically, how are you seeing this as a moment to transform mobility in a way that it also can support climate agendas? Right now, we are seeing transport many times as the fastest growing CO2 emission sector. What kind of advice would you give to the higher level decision makers in order to change the course of emissions in the transport sector as we are facing COVID-19?
Being called as a veteran makes me feel quite old. So thanks for that. I think it's like many people also before talked about. This is a window of opportunity. We either go to a heaven or to a hell scenario. So in terms of also the COVID, and I think front and center is the immediate also response in the next weeks and months. And here the economy is playing a key role, like Philip wrote also explained earlier, really in detail, which is great. We're talking about green stimulus, but we now also have to provide also the information also, where are the policy briefs, where also the detailed information also for decision makers to say, oh, this is also the way also we have to invest towards aligning with SDGs, aligning also with climate. So again, it's partially a knowledge and partially then also policy advocacy role. And I would say with that, if we would say we would, as a community, coming together saying, these are also the green stimulus, and we link that also to the NDC, like Maruša Kadema from Slovakia highlighted earlier, bring that into your 10 principles. Say, okay, we're reporting on the future, our investment and the international finance investment as part of COP26 in Glasgow. I think that will be a key step forward. So yeah.
Thank you, Holger, and thank you also for coming live on air on TUMI TV today as we cover the globe and report the latest and greatest around sustainable mobility transformations in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you, Holger, for being with us. And with these final words, I'm also giving back into the studio and looking forward to what's coming up on TUMI TV. Thank you very much, Holger.
Thank you, Daniel. Pleasure. Have a good day.
Now we are coming to a topic which concerns many of us. How can the economic recovery be sustainable? We saw fewer planes and cars in the recent weeks. While this endangers employment, it saves million tons of carbon emissions. So we need to secure employment and at the same time reduce emissions. That might not be an easy process, but there are already many ideas on how to balance these two arguments. I am looking forward to the insights during this session.
So I'm very happy to hand over to Florent Menegaux. He's the CEO of Michelin, and he's going to talk about the various perspectives that Michelin and Moving On are taking in face of the COVID-19 crisis and transport.
Good afternoon, Mr. Menegaux. You are the CEO of Michelin. What does a global pandemic mean for a global company like Michelin, and how are supply chains affected?
What you need to understand is that for Michelin, safety comes first. So as we run a global operation, in light of the pandemic, we have reached the pandemic in China very early in 2020. So we knew something very serious was happening. So we've learned very quickly from China, and then we have exported in Europe and then North America and all around the world all the learnings we had in China. So we've closed down some operations gradually and systematically to make sure that we could run safely our operations. And very soon after that, we have put all the process together to make sure that our people could restart their operations safely. And we have restarted all our operations gradually, and it takes a long time to make sure to restart an operations like the production of a tire. There are many suppliers that are involved all around the world. So when you shut down your production very quickly, but you restart very gradually and very slowly. That's why it was very important to restart as soon as possible all our operations.
With moving on, Michelin supports concrete action towards sustainable mobility. What kind of action do you see, and how would you recommend to catalyze these moments for a strong shift to sustainable transport?
The very existence of Moving On is a major step towards sustainable mobility. For the first time, all mobility stakeholders are talking to each other, exchanging ideas, working on shared issues. Representatives from governments, from cities, CEOs, academics, students are coming and sharing their ideas, all in one event, which is called Moving On Summit, once a year. To prepare all the content that is shared and discussed during Moving On Summit, during the year, we have established a new ecosystem named Moving On Lab with more than 200 different corporations, NGOs, etc., coming on board and tackling different dedicated subjects. So it's this ecosystem of Moving On Lab with the summit once a year that makes the Moving On ecosystems very valuable, and that's so unique in the world that is tackling all the sustainable mobility issues. So this unique ecosystem is what makes Moving On so special. Due to the COVID-19, we had to stop the summit. We could not gather the thousands of people that are coming normally to this event. And but it was important for us to continue entertaining all the communities because all the issues of sustainable mobility are still there. So we've decided to handle early June at the dates of the Moving On Summit to handle a Moving On digital summit. We will focus on key communities of interest, which is the capacity to demonstrate concrete results. For instance, we will have a focus on zero-emission freight vehicles, which are key to curb increasing freight emissions and mitigate climate change on urban air, for example, and spur technology innovation. This virtual session, in coordination notably with the Transport Decarbonization Alliance, demonstrate our commitment to the UN and United Nations Climate Action Summit that was taking place last September in New York, and where was launched this act, which is Actions Towards Climate-Friendly Transport, and which, of course, Michelin is part of, and Moving On is part of. And all of this, TUMI, ACT, United Nations, and TDA are forming an alliance to tackle the key transportation decarbonization issues.
As the CEO of a global company, you're able to observe trends around the world. Do you have a handle on longer-term effects on the transport sector of COVID-19?
What the first learning we have on this COVID-19 is that confinement and lack of mobility is counter nature to human beings. So I think this is a major learning. We have a demonstration that when half of the world population is locked down, the economy collapses and people are not happy. It creates anxiety, and human beings are made to move. So that's the first learning. The second learning is that corporations have a big stake in making this movement better, more earth friendly, more environmental friendly, and therefore corporations will play a key role in the future to make sure that we can have more mobility for more people with far less impact. And I'm absolutely convinced of that. So the other learning is that as human beings, we are vulnerable. We are vulnerable in different dimensions. One is we are vulnerable to viruses. We are vulnerable in a damaged environment. So for us, in order to project ourselves into a better world, we really need to have corporations in alignment with the public sector as well, to form all the conditions that will be necessary to create a more sustainable mobility, which is essential for human beings.
So what is needed for a green recovery, and how can moving on support it?
The fact that the world has entered into a massive pandemic did not stop the global warming, did not stop the lack of biodiversity, but it has shown that when the transport slows down, you have very quick recovery effect on the air, on the CO2 emissions. So, and we have to remind ourselves that transport represents around 28% of the global CO2 emissions around the world. So what we have to do is, coming out of the pandemic, as we will have to put a lot of money to restart all our economies, we have to make sure that that money is also used to transform the transport offer, to decarbonize the vehicles, so that we can have not only an economic recovery, but also we can move towards the less than 2 degrees increase in the global warming, which is absolutely necessary for a better life of all the people around the world. All what we have been discussing, for me and for Michelin, will only be possible if we form an alliance between the private and the public sector. When it comes, for example, for the development of new technology, hydrogen fuel cells, for example, it is very important that the public sector, through the public companies, public corporations, start ordering vehicles, fuel cell vehicles, and they initiate, therefore, small markets that will be necessary for corporations, then private corporations, then to invest and to develop the technology. The public sector also has to create the regulatory environment so that corporations understand where they can make a difference and where they can invest safely, because they will be safeguarded by proper regulation.
Thank you, Florent Menegaux. It was a pleasure having you. As we could see, the challenges we are facing are enormous, not only for sustainable transport, but also for the entire transport industry. I'm happy to see that ambition and positive energy prevails, and that we are seeing strong actors supporting climate action in the transport sector.
How has the COVID-19 crisis impacted the transport sector in your client countries, especially urban transport?
It had a huge impact on urban transport. As you can imagine, operator had to invest for social distancing. It was a requirement from the health point of view, and it was something that was not planned. Also, the number of passengers in metro, commuter train and ride-sharing platform has been slashed. It's clear that it led to a difficult financial situation for a lot of small operators, in particular, who didn't have a strong financial structure. it's clear that the informal sector in developing countries is one of the first victim of this difficult situation. People were not able to run their business the way they used to do it, and they had to also invest in additional measures to keep people safe. These had a huge ripple effect. Cities' competitiveness is affected. Quality of life is affected as well, and you have a more and more situation where people cannot sustain a business in the transport sector. So that will take time and strong initiative to go back to normal, and that's what I'm seeing government doing right now, trying to find solutions to address these challenges. And also new solutions needs to be thought about, particularly when it comes to urban transportation. We had a model where we were pushing people to move in mass transit to reduce CO2 emission. In this context, we need to find and think about alternative way of combining these two objectives, which is to reduce emission, but at the same time to keep people safe.
Can you briefly describe the World Bank's short-term and medium-term response to the pandemic?
Yes, the World Bank has been one of the main international organizations to provide resources to fight the coronavirus pandemic. Over the next 15 months, close to $160 billion will be made available to country, and it's very important because it will not only be a large sum of money, but also it will affect a large number of countries. 2 days ago, we had recorded 100 countries which have received financial support from the World Bank to respond to the health crisis that they are facing. 55 billion of this is going to Africa, which is quite important. That these financial resources are coming from different part of the World Bank Group, the private sector branch with IFC, the guarantee part with MIGA, and for the World Bank, for the IDA country, which are the poorest country, we are using the IDA window, and for the country which are slightly richer, we are using our IBRD windows. And all these total to $160 billion that will be disbursed over the next 15 months. After the first phase of the response, which was focused on the health response by helping countries to get the right equipment, the right mask, respiratory equipment, and other type of medical equipment, the second phase will be concentrated on economic recovery. What is the day after? What do people can envisage from the government, and what they can do to bring back the economy to a normal path? The normal will be a new normal, a normal where until we get a vaccine, a certain number of basic precautions will need to be taken, and that will affect somewhere the return of investment of a certain number of people in small and medium enterprises, but also in large enterprises. So all this is something that we are thinking about, how our resources will be channeled through the banking sector to support small and medium enterprises, to support activities which are essential to the growth of a country.
What are your recommendations for decision makers on how to overcome this crisis, especially when it comes to urban transport?
I think that we have a certain number of measures. In the short term, the first one is to ensure that the sanitary protocol are used in transport and used in a very rigorous way and very strict way, because without it, we have a risk of having a second wave or third wave of contamination. Secondly, to ensure that the basic mobility is available for the critical workers. We are going back now to work, and who need to be supported in reaching their workplace. Third, financial sustainability of the transport operation will be important, and I think that a part of it is to resume the activity and help particularly the laid off workers to find another way of living, of earning their living, and maybe to be re-employed in the same company when the conditions are met. Fourth, restore the supply chain. I think it's very important to restore the supply chain, which has been a lot disturbed, and you can see that in some countries food prices are increasing, largely due to the fact that the supply chain has been very much disturbed in those countries. Lastly, it gives us also an opportunity to use the transport sector to create some new jobs, and I'm thinking more particularly about labor-intensive activities for road maintenance and rehabilitation, which will be a way to bring back people to work, but also to rebuild and maintain infrastructures that are so needed to be able to improve the productivity and the competitiveness of the sector.
How can the World Bank help client countries to address the impact of the COVID-19 crisis and to build more resilient transport systems?
We need to first of all to work with the company to see how we could help them restructure and give them working capital to restructure their company. As you know, and as I've said earlier, a lot of the capital of the companies didn't have enough working capital, and that's been exacerbated by the current situation. We also need to think how we can take that opportunity to continue the effort of greening transportation, and I think this is a very good opportunity now as we are moving toward rebuilding the sector to be able to provide incentive for people to use green means of transportation. I'm talking about e-mobility, and I know that TUMI is very much active in that area, and I think that it would be something that we will need to continue doing and accelerate, and take that as an opportunity to be able to build e-mobility and to use all the means that we have, being digital, on other means, to be able to have a transportation sector which is greener as we are coming back out of this pandemic.
Thank you, Makhtar Diop and Lena Stiller, for your insights. Please accept our apologies for the technical difficulties during our last interview. Let's move on with our program.
The Mobility Institute Berlin just published a strategy paper on COVID-19 and the transport sector. The paper assesses the pandemic itself, the influence on our mobility behavior, and gives ideas on how public transport should adapt to these changes. Let's have a closer look at what the author Jörn Richert was worked on.
You have conducted a study on the public transport situation throughout the COVID-19 pandemic. What are your main findings?
So when we decided to do that study, we were looking at the current debate on how public transport operators and other institutions were dealing with the onset of the crisis. And we realized that a lot of important and good things were happening, but we had the feeling that the long-term perspective was a little bit out of scope at that point. So what we were trying to do with the study is to actually have a look at the longer-term repercussions of the crisis on urban mobility and the public transport sector. So what we did was basically three things. The first one was we had a look at the ongoing pandemic to see what we're up against, basically. And the first message there is the crisis is not over, or specifically the pandemic is not over. And we had a look at three different phases. The first is the sort of immediate crisis phase, the one that we are in now and we are slowly leaving, hopefully. The second one will be a calibration phase where for the next around 18 months, measures pandemic measures and restrictive measures have to be balanced against economic and societal needs and demands. And then in the longer term, beyond 18 months, we probably have a conclusion phase of the crisis where things are slightly getting back to normal. The most important thing in this regard, I think, is this 18-month benchmark, which is defined by the World Health Organization and others as the point where people expect a vaccine to be available, which will be a game changer in terms of how the pandemic will evolve. So the message there is we will have to deal with the pandemic for quite a long time. Then the second point we had to look at is mobility behavior, which means how do people react to the crisis and what do public transport operators have to expect. There, and particularly for this calibration phase, so for everything that happens in the next 1.5 years, we had two major findings. And the first one is demand will be volatile because we have to expect recurring infection waves and upcoming restrictions again. So there will be a back and forth of like more open phases and more closed phases, which will obviously be reflected in overall mobility demand as well as in public transport riderships. And the second one is more flexibility. So we expect people to choose their mode of transportation basically on a weekly or even daily basis based on the overall risk perception and the overall governance situation and crisis governance. So that's two things that public transport has to react to and deal with over the coming months and maybe even years. The third point we went into is then what does that actually mean for strategy? And I think our main statement is crisis management is really important, but it is not enough to focus on immediate crisis management. So public transport as a sector, which means governance bodies as well as operators, they need to think about longer-term strategy. So they have to think about like sort of how in the longer term they will approach the pandemic, and also what that means for their transformational issues over the next years, basically. We found 5 specific areas in which this applies, which are the first one is expansion of public transport offer. The second one is the expansion of multimodal offers, so the integration of public transport with, for example, bike sharing and car sharing and ride pooling. The third one is simple and flexible pricing. And then we have 2 more enabling factors. One, in the broad terms, digitalization, where public transport companies should push for. And the last one is agile organization, which basically means that institutions in the sector should start being quicker, like being able to make informed and quick decisions based on the volatility that they will face in the coming years.
You have mentioned digitalization as a key contributor to the post-COVID-19 mobility sector. Do you expect an acceleration of this topic due to the virus outbreak we're seeing right now?
Short answer, yes. So it will be tremendously important. Basically, we see two different areas where it can really help operators to make a difference. And the first, and I think that's the most obvious and discussed one, is at the customer interaction user interface. So you will probably see a big surge in mobile ticketing because like physical ticketing or buying tickets from a bus driver, for example, are just sort of risk factors if you have a situation in which you try to socially distance and to avoid surfaces that you touch. So in that area, definitely. Also, when it comes to information, so when it comes to informing your ridership about the current situation, the risk level, probably alternatives that they can take. If we jump into the multimodal part a little bit, we discussed, we had several interviews with public transport operators, and one thing that came up repeatedly was that there might be a chance to take pressure off the bus grid, for example, by offering multimodal alternatives. To basically tell people if the bus is packed, take a bike. And for those kind of options, it might be really important to actually proactively communicate to the ridership, to the passengers, and that's mostly a digital thing. So if you have an app, if you can send push notifications, that's basically real-time communication. It's very targeted, and that makes probably the most sense and the biggest impact for the moment. So this user interface is the first area where digitalization we expect it to be big in the coming months and years. The second one is analytics, like big data analytics in companies. And that is something that we feel operators try. There are pilots, but it's not entirely and deeply ingrained in the sector so far. So this is something where there's a lot of potential to use big data analytics, AI tools to make operations better, also to provide better services. Examples would be, for example, going into the planning of offer expansion, where you could use available data to actually plan your lines better. That is something that makes entire sense without the corona crisis, but it might be even more important in the corona crisis to actually develop a targeted offer that makes people use public transport as normally as possible. That's one thing. Another thing is a little bit more short-term or real-time, to have a look at the capacity of vehicles, of buses, for example. So you often have some sort of counting systems in the buses, which generate data. And if you would manage to use that data to either predict or just plot capacity levels and occupation levels in buses, this is something, again, that you could communicate to your ridership, your passengers, to make them aware of the current situation and also to avoid overcrowding.
How do public transport operators need to adapt to the new situation? And how do they need to be supported?
That's a very good question, actually. I think the first major part of adapting to this challenge is actually ongoing. That's crisis management. And as highlighted, the second one is long-term strategy and adopting that sort of strategy that it replies or responds to the challenges that the pandemic brings with it. So that's two things. And I think the third one is the integration of these three levels, which means often you have short-term incentives and short-term goals that do not necessarily align with long-term ambitions. One example would be if you move into the area of developing pop-up bus lanes, you will probably develop them on lines that are already existing. But then if your long-term goal tells you should actually change the line and sort of adapt where it goes, like add new stops, you might get into a situation where you have this pop-up bus line. You have a realistic chance of keeping that in the long term, but then in the long term the line will go somewhere else. So you basically lost the potential of using this bus line for better service in the long term. That's just one example that shows that it actually makes sense thinking about long-term goals while you're responding to the pandemic, and use what you can do now, because it's also a window of opportunity in which you can do things that otherwise would not be possible. So the integration would lead to a situation where you use this opportunity to actually push for long-term success. That's the major things that public transport operators should look at. In terms of support, that is definitely a very difficult question. Since ridership has gone down, income has gone down, and I think a lot of operators struggle with their financials at the moment. There have been calls, quite repeated calls, for including public transport in support schemes that have been set up, and I think that's absolutely essential that public transport is included. And I think public transport has a good point to be included because urban mobility without public transport will not work. Quite simply, you will not be able to move so many people from A to B in another way. Bike is obviously important as well, but there has to be an integrated system, and public transport has to be the backbone of the system. So I think the major point at the moment is really lobbying, going to politicians and pushing the debate to be included into those support schemes, and to get financial support into the sector. That's one part, but also to do so, build a vision of where public transport could go in the coming years or decades, to not only demand money for keeping an operating system, but to really create something that those people who have the money, policymakers, states, the European Union, can look forward to. So give them a vision that makes them push into the right direction, and that makes them feel that they put their money into the right buckets.
Thank you, Jörn, Richert, for your assessment. We are sure that you will continue to follow the situation and keep on working out recommendations on how to make our cities more livable. For everybody interested in the paper, you can download it at mobilityinstitute.com.
Platform 12, now arriving RB2 Airbus.
TUMI is so successful because it connects all major players of sustainable mobility. Besides knowledge, TUMI also has several pilot projects around the world. Large-scale projects are taken up by the development banks of TUMI. KfW is one of them, financing, for example, metro projects in India. We now have the chance to speak with Mrs. Barbara Schnell. She is the head of the Sector Policy Department at KfW Development Bank, which handles sector-specific topics and knowledge management, and thus is at the forefront of answering the question how KfW responds to the economic downturn. Let's switch directly to her in Frankfurt.
Yeah, COVID-19 has definitely changed the situation of KfW a lot. At the very beginning of the crisis, we put out a €1 billion aid package on behalf of the German government, providing loans to companies in Germany of all sizes in order to safeguard their liquidity. In addition, we have invested in our partner countries in immediate emergency measures such as medical equipment, lab infrastructure and the like. And we have put together for our ministry an emergency package also covering other sectors apart from health, like SME finance, job creation, social security, food security, etc., in order to also battle the medium-term impacts of the crisis. In fact, our partner countries are facing a twin crisis. There is this outflow of foreign capital and fewer investments because foreign capital has played a crucial role in infrastructure investment in the past. Therefore, and also governments, they are focusing on health and the wider economy at the moment. Therefore, we need to keep focus on keeping up infrastructure investment and our portfolio and pipelines once the crisis fades. Our portfolio at the moment is still on track. Our partners and we are working very hard in order to keep up the progress of our infrastructure projects, and therefore we are doing quite well at the moment. So we need to keep up our efforts. It is severe. Due to lockdowns around the world, buses and trains have literally stopped running. People cannot get to work anymore and that cannot support their existence. Yeah, we need to pick up the bus services again very soon because people rely on them. At the same time, they need to be safe while using public transport, so hygiene standards need to be maintained. It's a large challenge. Yeah, at the moment, public transport companies forgo income. But after the crisis, their services will be needed. Economically, they are climate friendly, so big cities, metropolis rely on public transport. It needs to be available, it needs to be accessible for everyone. So during this crisis, public transport companies need to be supported by their governments, by their municipalities, for them to keep up or pick up the services after the crisis again.
Perfect. Thanks, Barbara Schnell, for showing us how KfW Development Bank is responding to the challenges. It is great to hear that KfW was already so active in countering the negative economic impact of Corona. We can see that there is a lot of capital needed to finance the infrastructure of sustainable mobility. We should not forget to include this in every recovery plan, since the cost of not including it would be even higher. We heard different experts on how to design a green economic recovery. Let's have a short break with content from our partners before we picking up again this interesting topic.
Hey everybody, it's Clarence Eckerson here from Street Films, and as you know that we're in the middle of a crisis here in the United States and all over the world with the coronavirus. So I decided before the city and the state implement more strict guidelines in getting around, I was going to take my bicycle into Manhattan, which I would do normally a few times a month, to get B-roll about public spaces and bicycling and walking and transportation in New York. So I will have a lot of footage to contrast with what I normally would see on a trip like this. And I'm going to go on a 20-mile excursion, stay well away from people, observing 10-foot rule wherever I can. I'm only touching my own bike. I'm not going to be stopping for food or anything. I have everything with me that I might need. And I'm going to try to show you guys what's going on our streets right now, how people are getting around, what everything looks like, and of course, how the bicycle is one of the best ways to get around right now. So I hope this serves as a sort of historical document for people to look back on. And there's a Long Island Railroad train that appears to have basically nobody on it. And we're coming up on Skillman Avenue, and I actually have seen my first signs of quite a bit of bike activity. Here we are, people doing some morning exercise, practicing plenty of social distancing. Now this is a little bit odd because usually by this time of the morning, if you were driving here, you couldn't find one parking space. All of these spaces are usually taken. Today, we practically don't even need a protected bike lane. And there's a 7 train that I can honestly tell you, I don't see one person standing, which would be very unusual. Look at this roadway. I mean, this is usually backed up for about a dozen to 15 blocks every morning. Almost any other morning except weekends, this would be backed up. On-ramp to the Queensboro Bridge bike and pedestrian ramp. Now the numbers are down because obviously a lot of people don't have to go to work anymore, but there's still quite a few people biking and walking on the bridge on the Queensboro. And the roadway, it's incredible. I've never seen the roadway move this quickly, except maybe early on a Sunday mornings. But also the air, I can't tell you the last time I went over this bridge and the air felt so clean. Very few drivers on the FDR today. Here comes the Roosevelt Island tram, and as you can see, almost nobody on that tram. That's very few people for one of their trams. Crosstown bike lane here on 55th seems to be pretty clear, probably because of the abundance of parking spaces due to not so many people being out in their cars. I think I've gone all the way from 2nd Avenue to what will be Broadway up here without having a car in the bike lane. There's some toilet paper. Toilet paper! Park Avenue. Park Avenue, of course, what it looks like during summer streets is quite different. You could almost do a summer streets right now based upon the number of cars are here. We are all, of course, want some hope. We want some hope. And We don't want to be afraid of anyone, but you know, we got to practice our 6 to 10 feet of separation, sadly. Heading to Times Square next. There are a few tourists here in Times Square practicing social distancing, of course. Look at all that advertising and nobody to see it. Lots of advertising. Why is it even on? But there's nobody here. This is quite spooky. I've shot footage probably dozens of times in Times Square. And it's almost a ghost town today. Yeah, basically no comment right there. I'm just gonna leave that there. Almost no one sitting outside Macy's here. Still have the seats out. A little bit of traffic on 34th Street. This section of Broadway has not one car driving on it, but I can count 6 bicycles. That's a pretty good ratio, 6 to 0. Lots and lots of deliveries everywhere you look. We have delivery workers that are literally risking their lives to make dozens of deliveries per day so that we can stay in our homes, so a lot of us can still eat. So I hope everybody's giving out big tips and thanks. I'm pretty amazed to find that the green market is still on and there are customers. And of course, as you notice here, the busway is even more clear than usual. Not many people out, not many drivers, and you've got the busway right here. This bike lane is often problematic, but today nobody's blocking the 13th Street bike lane. Only thing blocking this bike lane is ice. A lot of speed on the avenues in Manhattan today where there is traffic. You can see traffic is moving at a pretty good clip. People waiting outside Trader Joe's because they're obviously limiting the number of people that can go in at a time. Over here I rode once with Mark Gorton during his typical rush hour commute, and it was filled by people and bikes. Today, a few bikes. So as I expected, Central Park is a little more populated than most places because people are out here, they gotta get their exercise. Most people seem to be maintaining that social distance, even if they're running with a friend or a loved one. So, you know, still get out there and get their exercise. I am today. I'm just out here with my camera getting my exercise, staying away from people as much as possible.